welcome back to a brand new project. In this project, we are going to build a New Year countdown timer. As you can see from the final version, we'll have a timer that counts down as it gets closer to 2022. At the time of this recording, it is December 6, 2021.
December 6.
So there are 25 days, 2 hours, and 50 minutes left until 2022.
22.
We'll use JavaScript to dynamically create these numbers by fetching the current time and date from the computer and updating them inside this container. In the next section, we'll get started with the HTML part of our project. I'll see you in the next section. All right, let's dive into the project. First, let's open Visual Studio Code. Once it's open, we'll close the Get Started tab, then go to the File menu and click on Open Folder. I'm going to create the project on my desktop, but you can create it anywhere you like on your computer. To start, let's click on the desktop. Next, we'll click on the New Folder button to create a new folder. We'll name this folder New Year Countdown. This will be the name of our project, so let's press Enter. Now we'll click on Select Folder to choose the folder we just created. Once that's done, we can close the Get Started tab. Moving over to the Explorer section on the left, we're going to create an HTML file. Just right-click in that area and select New File. Name the file index.html and press Enter. Now our index.html file is open on the right. It's completely empty for now, but we can use an exclamation point to quickly generate an HTML5 boilerplate. Simply type an exclamation point and click on the first auto-suggestion. Now we have our HTML5 boilerplate. The first line includes the doc type, which tells the browser which version of HTML the page is using. Since we are using HTML5, we just specify HTML5 there. Next, we have the HTML tag, which wraps around the head and body tags. The HTML tag serves as the top-level element of our HTML file. The lang attribute is used to set the language of the page. Since we're working in English, we'll just set the lang attribute to en. Then we have the head tag, which contains 3 meta tags and 1 title tag. The charset attribute inside the first meta tag defines the HTML character encoding. We'll use UTF-8, which is recommended for web developers because it supports almost all characters and symbols. Next is the compatibility meta tag, which tells Internet Explorer to use the most recent rendering engine, Edge. We also have the viewport meta tag, which instructs the browser on how to resize the page. Let's use Alt-Z to turn on word wrap so we can see all of our code clearly. Inside that last meta tag, the content attribute is divided into 2 sections. The first section tells the browser to set the page width to match the device's screen width. For example, a mobile screen will have a much smaller width than a computer screen. The second part of the viewport content attribute sets the initial zoom level of the browser. By default, this is set to 100%. Finally, we have the title tag, which sets the title displayed in the Browser tab. To view your results directly inside Visual Studio Code, you can use the Live Preview extension. First, we just need to right-click on the index.html file. Then we'll click on Live Preview and select Show Preview. Now we have the browser open on the right side. It's currently empty, but you'll see the default title is Document. Let's close the Explorer section to give us a bit more space on the right. Next, let's change the page title to our project name, New Year Countdown. As you can see, the Browser tab now displays our New Year Countdown title. Now let's move on to the HTML inside the body section of our index file. To start, we'll add an H2 tag for our heading. Inside that tag, we'll write Countdown to New Year. After that, we'll add a div with a class of year because we want to display the year 2022. At the time I'm recording this video, it's December 2021, so 2022 is the upcoming year. So I'll just type in 2022. Of course, depending on when you are watching this, you might want to use 2023 instead. Next, we'll add another div with a class of countdown. Inside this, we'll include placeholders for days, hours, minutes, and seconds. So we'll place another div inside this one specifically for the day. For now, we'll just hard code it as 0. We'll change this value dynamically using JavaScript later on. We can copy this 3 more times using Alt-Shift-Down arrow, and then we'll change day to hour. Apologies, I meant to say the label is changed. So after hours, we have the div for minutes. And the last one will be for seconds. We'll set these to 0 for now, but just like before, we'll update them dynamically with JavaScript. That wraps up the HTML portion of our project. In the next section, we're going to start styling our project using CSS. I'll see you in the next section. All right, now that we've finished the HTML part of our project, in this next section, we are going to start styling everything using CSS. First, we need to create a new CSS file. To do that, we'll click here and open the Explorer section using Ctrl-Shift-E. On the left side in the Explorer section, we'll right-click, select New File, name it style.css, and press Enter. Before we can use CSS in our project, we need to link this CSS file within our HTML code. To do this, we'll go back to index.html and add a link tag right after the title tag. Just type link and click on the third auto-suggestion, which is the one for CSS. Now we have a link tag that establishes the relationship between our HTML file and the external style sheet. Since both files are in the same directory, we just need to set the href attribute to style.css. With that set up, we're ready to start using CSS in our project. Let's go ahead and save this file using Ctrl-S. Next, we'll close the Explorer section to create more workspace on the right side. Now let's switch over to style.css to start styling our project. First, we'll start by targeting the body section, so we'll just type body. Then we'll open a set of curly braces. First, let's remove the default margin from the page. We can do this by simply writing margin 0. Next, let's change the display to flex so we can center our content horizontally. To do that, we'll just write display flex. Since the default flex direction is row, you'll notice the elements are sitting next to each other. Let's change the flex direction to column instead. Now, we can use align items center to bring the items to the horizontal center. To center them vertically as well, we first need to set the height of the body to 100% of the viewport height. Then we'll use justify content center to bring everything to the vertical center. Let's also change the font of the page by using the font family property. For example, we can set it to cursive. Next, let's change the background color to something like slate blue. And I think that covers everything we need for the body section. Now let's continue styling our project by targeting the H2 and the year. To start, we'll target the H2 element here. We'll just write H2. First, let's change the text color to white. Then we can use the text transform property and set it to uppercase to make all the text capitalized. Next, let's increase the space between each letter by setting the letter spacing to 4 pixels. That's all for the H2 styling. Now let's move on to the year 2022. To style this, we'll just target this specific class. So we'll just type a dot followed by the class name here. After opening our curly braces, let's increase the font size to 5em. Next, we'll change the text color to white. We also want to make the text a little bit bolder. To do that, we'll use font weight bold. All right, now let's continue with the zeros representing the days, hours, minutes, and seconds. First, we need to target the container div we have here. We can target this by using the .countdown class.
.countdown.
It looks like we just missed the T here. Let's add a margin of 30 pixels to push it down a little bit. Then we'll change the background color to black, but with 30% transparency. We can use the RGBA function for this, setting red, green, and blue to 0 to get black. And we'll use 0.3 for 30% transparency. You can see the background color appearing there. However, we'll need to set the zoom to 200% to see it clearly. Next, let's change the text color to white. We'll also change the height to be 20 pixels. The next step is to change the display to flex, which will bring these zeros next to each other. We can use justify content, center to center everything horizontally, and align items center to center them vertically. After that, we can target each of these individual numbers using their div. We'll just use the countdown class to target each one. So we'll target the countdown div. Now let's set some margin here. We'll set the top and bottom margins to 0 and the left and right margins to 15 pixels. This helps to space them out a little bit. First, let's change the font size to 2.5 pm.
PM.
Next, we'll change the font weight to 500. So this one looks just fine. Now, we want to move these zeros up a little bit, so we can add some ticks at the bottom. This is where we'll display the days, hours, minutes, and seconds. To do that, we'll just change the top margin to -25 pixels. We could also change it here, but this works perfectly fine too. And there we go, that's it. Next, let's move on to adding the labels like days, hours, and other units. We can target these elements by using their specific IDs. But first, we need to add a before pseudo-element. So we'll start by selecting the countdown class. Then for the day element, we'll use the before pseudo-element. First, we'll set the content property to be empty. This is because by default, we won't be able to see them yet. We'll need to target them separately to make them visible. Once that's done, we can position them using this property. So here we'll just write countdown. And let's target the day element first. The before pseudo element needs to have a content property. In this case, the content will be days. You can see it appearing here now. Now we can copy this 3 more times using Alt-Shift-Down arrow. And this next one will be hours. Then let's capitalize this. Next we have the hours, and then we'll add minutes. And this one is for the minutes. This one is for seconds. And finally, we have the seconds right here. Now that we've set them up, we can start styling them here. Let's bring all of them together. First, we'll set the position to absolute. This makes it absolute and relative to its parent, which is located right here. So we position this one relatively. Then we'll set the bottom property to -30 pixels. This moves them down just a little bit. Next, we'll set the left property to 0. Then we'll change the font size to 0.35 em. This makes the text a little bit smaller. We'll also change the line height to 35 pixels. To make them uppercase, we'll use the text transform property. Set it to text transform uppercase. Next, we'll increase the space between each letter by setting the letter spacing to 1 pixel. We'll also change the font weight to 500. Then we'll set the width to 100% and the height to 35 pixels. You might not see the changes immediately, but you'll notice them when you change the zoom level of the page. To bring them to the center, we can add align items, center at the top here. Now let's change the width of the parent to 100 pixels. This gives them a nice amount of space from each other. Now we can see the days, hours, and minutes much more clearly. And that wraps up the CSS part of our project. In the next section, we're going to use JavaScript to dynamically create the numbers, showing the real time remaining until the upcoming year, which is 2022 in my case.
In my case.
I'll see you in the next section for the JavaScript part of our project. All right, we have just finished the CSS part of our project. In this next section, we're going to add functionality to our project using JavaScript. First, we need to create a new JavaScript file. To do this, we'll click here and open the Explorer section using Ctrl-Shift-E. Then in the Explorer section on the left, right-click and select New File. Name the file index.js and press Enter. Before we can use it, we must link this JavaScript file within our HTML code. Now, let's go back to index.html. At the very end of the body section, we'll add a script tag by just typing sc. From the list, we'll click on the second auto-suggestion, which is the one with the src attribute. Since both index.html and index.js are located in the same directory, we just need to write index.js as the source URL. We can close the Explorer section now since we don't need it anymore, giving us a bit more workspace on the right. Let's save this file using Ctrl-S. Now, we can start using JavaScript in our project by bringing our HTML elements into our script. The elements we need are the zeros for days, hours, minutes, and seconds, as we'll be changing them dynamically using JavaScript. This div here has an ID of day, and the others are hour, minute, and finally second. To select an element using its ID attribute, we can use the getElementById method in JavaScript. So inside index.js, let's start by creating a constant. We'll call it dayElement and use the document.getElementById method to return that specific element. And the ID of that element is day. We can use Alt-Z to turn on word wrap so we can see all of our code clearly. And let's close this section a little bit. Let's also bring this countdown to new heading to the center. That was the H2 element. So we'll just set it to text align center. We can also remove the scroll bars by adding overflow hidden to the body section. All right, everything looks good so far. Now let's head back to index.js to continue selecting our elements. The next element we want to select is the hour. So we'll say hour element and then document. We'll use getElementById and set the ID to hour. Next, we'll do the same for the minutes element. We'll create a constant and use document. We'll use getElementById with the ID minutes. Next up is the seconds element. We'll create a constant called secondElement and use document.getElementById with the ID second. All right, now we have all our elements selected. The only things left to do are to get the current date from our computer and also define the target date, which is the first day of 2022. All right, so we can get that using the new date constructor. So we'll just set new year date equal to a new date constructor. In this case, the date is January 1st, 2022. And the time is set to 00 because it's at midnight. All right. Now, we'll need to use the getTime method to get the timestamp for that exact date. Essentially, getTime is used to retrieve the time. Next, we'll create a function here to handle the New Year countdown. We'll call this function updateCountdown. We just need to call this function at the top of our script. This way, it will run as soon as the page is loaded. I've also removed an extra A that was here. So now let's look at how we get the current time. Right now it's 5:56 p.m. on December 6th, 2021, which is the time I'm recording this video. So we'll just grab this one. We'll just say const now and set it equal to new date. This will represent the current date. So we leave the constructor empty. By leaving it empty, we get the current time, and then we can use the getTime method again. Now, let's check the value of now using console log. Go ahead and open your console. You'll see this number is based on the current second. If you refresh the page, you'll see a new number every time. because it's based on the seconds. So as a few seconds pass, the number will change. If we also console log the New Year date, we'll see two different timestamps. The New Year date will always stay the same. Even if you refresh the page, you'll always get the same number for the new year. However, the current time is always changing.
Yeah.
Let's rename this one. Instead of saying New Year Day, let's use New Year Time to make more sense. Next, we have a gap between the current time and the new year. To represent this, we'll create another constant and call it gap. The gap is calculated by subtracting now from the new year time. This gap will always get smaller because the new year is a constant value, while now keeps increasing every second. We can verify this by console logging the gap. Let's open the console here. Right now, the gap is this value. But let's see what happens when we refresh the page. It's getting smaller, it's down to 63. Now it has become 55. Every time we refresh, the gap decreases because now is increasing while the new year remains constant. All right, now let's create constants for seconds, minutes, hours, and days. As I mentioned, the new year time and now values are both based on milliseconds. So to define a second, we use 1000 milliseconds. Let's create a constant called second and set it to 1000. Next, we'll create another constant for minutes by multiplying second by 60. That gives us 60,000 milliseconds. The next one would be hour, which is also minutes multiplied by 60. And finally, we have day, which is hour multiplied by 24. Since there are 24 hours in each day, this completes our time units. So now we have constants for seconds, minutes, hours, and days ready to go. Finally, we can calculate the remaining days until the new year. We'll create a variable for the remaining days, let's call it d, and set it to Math.floor of the gap divided by a day, since the division will result in a fraction. Because the result isn't always a whole number, we use Math.floor. Let's console log it to check the value. As you can see, the value is 25. If we hadn't used Math.floor, it would be something like 25.12 because the time is constantly changing. However, we don't want the decimal part here, as we'll use the remainder for the minutes, hours, and seconds. So we'll just take the floor value and use the remainder for the rest of our calculations. Next, we'll calculate the hours using Math.floor. We'll apply Math.floor to the remainder of the gap. Specifically, it's the remainder of the gap divided by a day. We get that remainder here by using the modulo operator on the gap and the day. This means we've found the remainder of this division. Next, we divide this by our hours. If you log the hours, you'll see that we get 2. So we have 25 days and 2 hours left until the new year. Since we're using the floor function on this number, we're left with the remaining hours and days. Now, let's create another constant and call it minutes. For this, we'll use Math.floor. This will represent the remainder of the gap divided by the hours. So this is the remainder of the gap over hours, and this next one is over minutes. Finally, we have the seconds. Following our pattern, this will be the remainder from the previous step. So we have the remainder of the gap over minutes, and this one over seconds. Now we have the days, hours, minutes, and seconds ready. We just need to display them inside the HTML elements we created earlier. First, let's handle the days. We'll set the day element's inner text equal to D. As you can see, it now displays 25 days. Next, we set the hour element's inner text equal to H, and we can see it shows 2. Then we set the minutes element's inner text equal to M, which gives us 54 minutes. Finally, we set the seconds inner text equal to S. As you can see, we now have 25 days, 2 hours, 53 minutes, and 57 seconds left. Each time we refresh, the amount decreases because we're getting closer to 2022. However, we can't expect a user to refresh the page manually to see the updated numbers. Instead, we can use the setTimeout method to set a timer that executes a function once the timer expires. So let's implement the setTimeout method here. This method will call our update countdown function every single second. Since we want it to run every second, we'll use 1000 milliseconds. Now you can see the numbers refreshing every second as the function is called within the JavaScript. This ensures we always get the most up-to-date count for the seconds. And that wraps up our project. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot of new things along the way. I'll see you in the next project.